Thank you, Rahul. Thank you all for coming for this ISAS book launch come book discussion. We have four panelists. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask each of them to try to restrict themselves to about 10 minutes each, so we can get more time for question and answer. Just let me quickly introduce the four speakers. We have on my right Ambassador Chan Eng-wing, Singapore's High Commissioner to Bangladesh, Professor Raja Mohan, who is Visiting Research Professor in ISAS, Professor Rajesh Basru, who is Professor in the Rajaratnam School of International Studies, and Mr. Kwa Chong Wan, Senior Fellow in the Rajaratnam School of International Studies. So maybe we'll start in the order stipulated here, so maybe Ambassador Chan can start first.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I think the panel discussion should not just be a review of the book. The book has done its work. I think if we can, it would be interesting to see whether we can explore other ideas further. The relationship between China and South Asia, as Professor Muni has rightly pointed out, is sometimes a lot more distant than what is assumed to be. I take my points from some of the experience I've had of living in China for 4 or 5 years, both as the Consul General in Shanghai and then as the Chief Representative of Temasek in China. And the reaction that our Chinese friends have had. It would seem that at least historically, the relationship between China and India, which one would have thought would have been very close, is actually not that close, and the occasions of contact have not been that great. Often the contact has been referred to 2 Buddhist monks who went from China to India, one before the Tang dynasty, the Sui dynasty, and another one a little later, as well as the trips of Admiral Zheng He, which was in the 1400s, when he came into the Indian Ocean and visited different parts of the Indian Ocean, including Africa. Interestingly, as curiosity in preparing for this, I looked at the timeline of both the Mauryan Empire and the Gupta Empire in India, the two perhaps the most well-known and the most established Indian empires in its medieval times. It did not coincide with the height of the great Chinese empires. The first of the empires was pre-Tang. It ended just before the Tang dynasty. The contact that the Tang dynasty had with the West was actually more with some of the Seleucid Empire, the leftover of Alexander the Great's general, rather than with India. The thrust of India's influence into China was that of religion, which entered and spread very widely. And indeed, in at least 2 of the dynasties in China that had the closest relationship with Tibet and therefore with India were both empires that were from outside of China. The first, of course, was the Mongol Empire, and the other one was the Manchu Empire. Part of it, scholars say, is because of the similarity between the Buddhism practice by the Manchus and the Mongols, and that practice by the Tibetans. And that was perhaps the closest that Tibet and China really came to. And if you go to Beijing today, there is still a very lovely piece of land that for some reason Capital Land managed to get hold of, but they cannot touch a particular historical building down there And the historical building is actually the palace of the Dalai Lama. And during his visits to China in those days, the emperor, it was Qianlong at that time, Qianlong would come and see the Dalai Lama often to both discuss the sutras and to repeat sutras with him and to understand more about Buddhism. But other than that, the relationship between China and India in particular, and by extension many parts of South Asia, was not as large. I think it's salutary that Professor Moni has reminded us just now in his introduction about the importance of South Asia now to China, where it comes to the issues that China has to face in its western borders, in Xinjiang and in Tibet, that they will probably need the, not necessarily assistance, but there is be some understanding with the South Asian countries for them to look at these issues. The perception of the Chinese towards South Asia and to India seem to be probably divided into those views expressed, the official views of the government. There, the expressions are of great friendship and support. State Councillor, well, he stepped down already, State Councillor Dai Guo visited India last year around this time, in the middle of January. And there he made the statement that China is filled with friendly intentions towards India. And while each of the countries have focused their attention on developing their own country, China sincerely strives to develop long-term friendly relations with China. But this is all the diplomatic talk that the Chinese government takes, and I think that is their official position. But when you come down and look at the views expressed by the scholars, and especially on the internet, that's quite a different issue altogether. I think the Chinese, if I can put it a little bit crudely, has a certain sense of triumphalism at this time. And they felt a little challenged, especially when the Western scholars, journalists, talked about the rise of South Asia, but India in particular, and this discomforted them. And indeed, after the economic crisis of 2009, and where a lot of the Western economies took a beating, while China seemed to have escaped that quite well, to the extent that some Chinese planners were talking about disengaging themselves from the Western economy, which was quite silly, but it was the sort of talk that was going on. They turned their attention to the comments about the rise of India, the rise of the elephant versus the dragon, and seemed to have taken some enjoyment in talking about the fact that India is still beset by many, many problems, and that China was still moving ahead. Now, of course, this is chatter on the internet, and we take it seriously only to the point where people have this point of view, and they take themselves quite seriously. They see it in this way. It is quite fascinating that India in particular saw the comment by the Chinese PLA that the Indian Ocean does not belong to India, a statement which received a report from an Indian naval officer, I think his name was Commodore Basak, who said, well, the South China Sea is not China's either. And these are the sort of views, and in last year when I was in Bangladesh, I called on the Chinese ambassador because I was interested in asking him about China's interest in Chittagong, because it has already been reported about their interest in Hambantota as well as the port in Pakistan. He he said, no, this is not possible. This costs much too much money. We are not prepared to really finance it. What we're really interested in is that there is freedom of shipping in the Bay of Bengal, to which I said, well, as have many countries have the same view on freedom of shipping in the South China Sea. He did not respond to me. But China, at least, I think, sees the access to the Indian Ocean as their normal right. And why should they not be so? And the important thing, and it's pointed out in the book, is the fairly large sums of money that China has been prepared to spend in South Asia. I think it has already happened in Southeast Asia for many of our neighboring countries in ASEAN. They receive quite substantial support from China. Of course, it comes at a time when the US and Europe are really either not in the mood or not in the position to really be able to give the sort of money. And China at the present moment seems to at least have the wherewithal to pay for many of these things. At the same time, they see it as a continued enlargement of infrastructural development, because they are developing their own infrastructure quite enormously, and as Professor Muni pointed out just now, it is also the access that they have to have, and which consequently led to the view that Chittagong was going to be an important port, because if you can connect down through India and through Myanmar into Chittagong, that would be a very easy access to the sea from Yunnan province and Guangxi province. But that being said, it's still a lot of infrastructure development still to take place, and whether that can be done. The Chinese at this present moment at least don't seem to be pushing very fast ahead with that. But the Chinese have been known to play very long games, and at least for the time being, we don't see changes in the political leadership in the sense of radical different views and different political parties taking place. And so the development can proceed quite smoothly in a certain direction, and they can get away with that. But as for the South Asian interest in a resurgent China, I think the operative word down there is really resurgent. China has been there all this while. The interest was not there, but it's really because of the very large or heightened development in China, together with this sense of the military advancements that China has taken, that has alerted all our interests. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Chan. I'll pass the floor on to Raja, then to 15 minutes. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be part of this discussion, and let me begin by congratulating the ISAS for promoting one of the most neglected areas of study in terms of the relationship between the subcontinent and China. While the subcontinent has become a lot more important in recent years, whether it is Afghanistan, whether it is Burma, that the study of the region as a collective has tended to be neglected. And I think one of the things that this book does is to look at South Asia as a collective, how is it dealing with China. And I think historically, and I think both the region has been underestimated since the Second World War, but in many ways I think while China is resurgent and China's links with the region are going to grow, South Asia's own importance for China is also going to increase. So I think we are at a cusp of something new, and I think dealing with that is going to lead to, I think, a lot more interesting research projects down the road. I just wanted to make 3 sets of points. The first one is about the context. The second one I'll make a little bit about the text, the book itself, and then look at the prospect of where we go from here in terms of the beyond the current situation. So to come to the context, I think Professor Muni rightly pointed out, India, South Asia, the subcontinent, and China have been distant neighbors. That, in fact, probably, if you look at whole of Asia, probably the South Asians know the least about China, the familiarity with the Chinese culture. Most of the newspapers can't get the Chinese surnames right, whether it's Pakistanis who have the very close, deeper than the Indian Ocean and higher than the Himalayas. But you look at the Pakistani papers, they can't get the names right. What's the surname? What's the last name? What is the first name? So the unfamiliarity is so deep. No other region in the world has such unfamiliarity with China. But I think the big impact of what's happening right now is China is no longer a distant neighbor. It is, I think, becoming probably, arguably, the most important external player in the subcontinent. I think that's a transformation that we've seen, and I think this only just begun. I think China's impact on the region is going to grow. But the central point here is that there was no interaction, is largely true, but what little interaction there was, where ideas and power actually moved from the subcontinent into China. When Buddhism spread from the subcontinent through different routes, both from land, what is now the great southern part of the Silk Road, and by sea, huge contacts between South India and southern China, and Tan Sen has done some work. So there is a contact which existed up to 10th or 11th century, and then we saw things dissipate. And then with the British conquest of the subcontinent, power was radiating from the Raj into China. So it was actually the subcontinent, the projection of power was taking place from the subcontinent into China, or whether it was the British Raj's setting up of a provisional government in Xinjiang. We set up a little, what is it called, Kashgaria, that it was the Raj that set up Kashgaria. And if you go to, anybody goes to Kashgar, you can still see the British India's little mission out there, holding out called Chini Bhavan, or whatever it was called. Second, young husbands exploits from the Raj across the Himalayas into Tibet. That was the Raj which forced open Tibet and pushed the South Asian or the subcontinental power into China. And more dramatically and more consequentially, the Opium Wars. The Opium Wars, which essentially moving trade from India, growing opium in India, selling it China, buying tea and selling it back, and Singapore was right in the middle of it all. And this opium trade was the structure around which a lot of things have happened. We see the historians and novelists are beginning to look back at it, and some of our own capitalists actually grew out of the Raj's opium wars. And I think that's something, again, a use of Indian power, Indian force. If you look at the repeated interventions by the Indian Army, Indian Armed Forces in southern China, the Boxer Rebellion in Beijing itself, the Indian troops were the first to enter Beijing. So what we've had was a power radiating from the subcontinent, it was led by the British, of course, into China. Today what you're seeing is the great reverse. The Chinese power is beginning to radiate into the subcontinent, where Chinese have consolidated themselves for the land frontiers, and you've seen the spectacular increase of Chinese presence in South Asia. The largest trading partner, biggest aid giver, supplier of defense commodities. So if you look at any major indicator of modern activity between states, you see China becoming the reversing, in a sense that the great reverse has taken place, and we're really at the beginning of a situation where China is going to be a dominant, overwhelmingly important partner for South Asia, and not necessarily from the Himalayas, but from the south as well. That whether the Chinese presence in in Maldives or Sri Lanka, that the Chinese naval presence is going to be something. Again, I think we've talked about it earlier. So the first point then is about the great reverse, the reverse flow of the Chinese power into South Asia. The second point I wanted to say about the book itself. I think the book, unlike most edited books, and I think the book is very well organized. There is a careful attempt at producing comparative studies within a single framework. One part of each chapter looking at the bilateral relations, giving the country perspective. The second part looking at the structure of the relationship. What are the specific constituencies that are being developed in each country, and their attitude towards China, and how the balance between them works out. And finally, the prospect of where the current relationship will go. So I think to that extent, the book is a valuable compilation of different perspectives, and I think it fills an important gap. But I think I think looking at power, Professor Mani talked about balance of power and balance of payments. On balance of power, the central problematic we find is this. I mean, if you look at all the chapters, India has historically seen the subcontinent as an exclusive sphere of influence. Again, a notion that was derived from the Raj, that the unity of the subcontinent, no other power would be allowed to exercise influence. And the Chinese notion that, look, they got every right to develop equal relationships with the countries of South Asia. And what was a notional argument before became more consequential when China developed relations with Pakistan, initially with Nepal. But today, that India can no longer argue that, look, it's an exclusive sphere of influence, and India is under pressure to devise a whole new strategy to deal with this new geopolitical circumstance that's around it. So I think this is a big challenge for India and how India does. As far as India's neighbors are concerned, I think they're sitting pretty. It's a nice place to be in. That you have the China card or a China option to deal with the presumed, what my Chinese friends call Indian hegemony. Whenever they get upset with us, the phrase comes out. Indian hegemonism, I'm sure a lot of our neighbors agree with that. That Indian hegemonism needs to be, sorry.
The Chinese phrase is expansion.
Both something, the hegemony.
US hegemony.
Yeah, we're the small hegemon, we're the local Americans are the big hegemon. So I think I think it gives options for the India's neighbors of fairly doing, without doing much, actually balancing India's power. And I think that's what we've seen where most countries of India's neighbors actually reveling in establishing a relationship with China. And I think it's exactly what India did with Soviet Union and the United States. So there are no surprises there from a classical balance of power point of view. But the question is, how does this play out? Because India itself is expanding its engagement with China. So we're not going to tell our neighbors, look, I'm going to do $100 billion of trade with China, and you can't do any. I'm going to do 33% of the new power projects in India being built by the Chinese equipment, and I can't tell my neighbors that, look, don't buy Chinese power equipment. So I think so there is a divide within India. The security wallahs, the bad guys, caught in the World War of saying that, look, let's keep the Chinese out, let's build a great wall around South Asia. But the pragmatists in India are saying that, look, you've got to deal with the new power reality. There is no alternative but to come to terms with the rise of the Chinese power, and this needs a whole new policy. So I think that debate is going on in India. How this plays out, of course, it remains to be seen. The last point, where do we go from here? I think the first thing I think the first thing is how we imagine space is going to dramatically change in this part of the world. Now, we've traditionally seen China meant East Asia, South Asia was something else, and the two had really little connectivity. And I think what China has done in the last few years, actually 10, 12, 14 years now, once China launched the Go West strategy, or West Region Development Strategy in 1999, under Chiang Kai-shek, the dramatic transformation of Western China that has taken place in building infrastructure, in bringing modernization, development, road networks, pipelines, you've seen a dramatic alteration of how South Asia fits with Western China. In fact, I wish the map of the book, these two are not kept separate, but if you brought them together, you'd see something very interesting, which is Lhasa is still the closest port for Lhasa the closest port will be Calcutta. For Kashgar and Urumqi, the closest port will be Karachi. For Kunming, the closest port is Sitwe, or whatever, if they want to develop the old historic port in Sitwe. So geographically, Western China is adjacent to South Asia. And what China has done in the last few years is to do these spectacular grand projects linking Western China with South Asia, because logically the connections are down here at that building across the Karakorams. This is a spectacular project. In fact, Chinese did in the 70s, and today they're modernizing the Karakoram highway. They built the Lhasa railway line, which is going to come to the border of Nepal. They're doing the Great Pipeline on the railway line in Burma, and it is a the notion that, look, human activity can change geography. I think we're in the middle of a dramatic transformation of how we understood geography and the connections that are going to be forged between South Asia and Western China are going to be dramatic. The second point I think which you need to look at is on Afghanistan, where China historically has tended to keep away. What does China do now when the Americans withdraw in 2014? Does China step in and produce that integrative effect in northwestern subcontinent? Because until now, Chinese have played essentially the Pakistan card. But as Afghanistan enters a difficult phase, Professor Muni talked about China's vulnerabilities. How does China now deal with the transformation, the unfolding situation in Afghanistan, and how does it fit into the region? And the last point I wanted to make was, we're all talking about the American pivot to Asia, but is there a Chinese pivot to the West? That is, as America vacates the Middle East, and if China begins to, China, because its dependence on the Gulf oil is so deep, unlike the Americans where thanks to shale is going to come down, and India's own dependence is going to be dramatic. So the question is going to be, how does, if the Chinese dependence on the Middle East, what consequences does it have? Because South Asia sits in the middle, Pakistan becomes very important again. So you're going to see a whole range of new things in relation to Afghanistan. The last point is the triangular relationship between US, China, and India. And as somebody we talked about the other day, look, Indians have not endorsed the pivot, they've not criticized it. That there is an option for India still of normalizing, deepening cooperation with China, which could, of course, create complication for India's neighbors. If the Chinese feel threatened by the United States, would they change their attitude towards India? And what kind of an outcomes does it produce? So many things are possible here, but how the triangular dynamic plays out is going to have significant impact on the South Asia.
I'll hand the floor to Rajesh, who I think has a PowerPoint presentation.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start by saying that my presentation is going to be fairly prosaic, fairly narrow, in comparison to what has come before and what I'm sure will come afterwards. But I'm taking off from the two major points that, substantive points that came out of the book. One being what would be called the kind of split between Indian positive images and Indian negative images of the rise of China. And the second being the question of whether China is near or far. What I'm going to do here is basically look at three questions. First, what exactly is the likely strategic impact of China's rising profile in South Asia? Second, the expectation among many, I think, which needs to be perhaps examined more carefully, the question being whether China will be or is becoming a major South Asian power. And third, the fear that Professor Rajmohan mentioned, in a sense, among security walas in India. How real are the Indian fears of containment? And the way to handle this is basically is to look at China's actual power, or global standing as well as regional standing. Global standing first, because whatever you say, China's first commitment is not South Asia. China is an East Asian and even a potential global power in the making. So we look at China as a global power, both in economic and military terms, and then at China's influence in South Asia, both in economic and military terms. So let's begin with the military side, with the global side. And looking at the economic power of China, if we look at the very simple picture that I'm presenting here for want of time and space, basically, if you look at China's GDP as a percentage of the US in purchasing power parity terms, then you can see that there is a steady growth from 1990, 15.7 to today, roughly 75.1%, and projected to 2050, the US to be left behind, with China exceeding it by 118.1%. So you can see a startling rate of growth here. Yet at the same time, we must, be cautious in jumping to conclusions about the results of this growth, because in terms of GDP per capita, as predicted by two agencies, I took a combination of them, PricewaterhouseCoopers and the Carnegie Endowment. The actual growth in terms of percentage of China's GDP as China's GDP per capita as percentage of US GDP per capita is growing much, much slower. And even as late as 2050, will be just over a third of American per capita GDP. So that immediately sort of qualifies the notion that China is emerging as a huge power, number one power in the making. Let's look at military power. Here we see that China's total military spending as a percentage of US spending is significantly growing, but it is again very, very far behind as of today. And although I was not able to get projections about what the figure would look like in 2050, it's, I think, fairly reasonable inference that, in fact, China will remain well behind the United States in its capacity to spend militarily, particularly because its GDP per capita is going to be much lower. In sum, we can say that China's economy is growing rapidly, but in fact is much weaker than that of the US. Second, that China's military is growing, but is much weaker than the US. And together, I think the picture that we derive from this is that China is not emerging as a superpower. Let's look at the position in South Asia. China's rising influence, economic influence. Now, only one indicator I'm using, but there are so many that one can use, but the one which is most handy also is trade. And if you look at South Asian states, I'm not using India here, but because that's about 10% today, the trade with China as a percentage of their total trade. In all the cases, Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, it is growing significantly. Yet, please note also that India's percentage of trade is also growing significantly, perhaps at a slower pace, but then that's because the Chinese have had a start from a much lower level. And in fact, Nepal's trade with India is now over half as compared to just 11 years back. On the Pakistan-India side, it's still very small, and therefore I put an asterisk just to kind of clarify one point, which is that the potential trade is actually very much larger than it is now, and it is, I think, a matter of time following the granting of MFN status that India's percentage will increase significantly. Just last week, a report coming from ICRIER says that actually today's potential is 10 times what is actually there today. So even though we may not achieve that 10 times, it's going to be moving forward much more than we can figure out from this particular set of statistics. So overall, we can say the conclusion from these simple stats is China's share is growing rapidly, and India's share is also growing significantly, most notable in Nepal and Sri Lanka, where it is much bigger than that of China.